to our welcome to Green Bag Lunch with a focus on the new Cap and Invest program in New York State. I'll remind everybody that Greening USA is an all-volunteer organization that tries to produce a so-called Green Bag Lunch once a month, usually the second Friday. Most of you know, if you're not getting our newsletters, please check out greeningusa.org, and there's a button there to register to receive our newsletter directly. You can also find a button to become a member of Greening USA, and for the small price of $40 a year, you can call yourself a certified member. Right now, there's a problem accepting payments on our website, but we're working on it. You can always mail us your donations or membership dues the old-fashioned way, which is also the form is also on our website, greenusa.org. During our presentation, we would like to be certain that everybody is muted unless you're called on to speak. Our speaker will make a presentation of maybe 30 minutes and then engage in conversation with all of you. You can place questions in the chat as we go if you wish, and we'll take them as needed, when they came up. But normally, as you know, we like to wait till give our speaker an opportunity to speak. If there's some confusion about something, we might break in to breaking upon our speaker. So, and who will be today? Ethan Gormley, the climate justice organizer for Citizen Action of New York. We had planned to have Zazu Scott also join in. Zazu is the lead coalition organizer for New York News, but a last minute problem has come up and she is not able to join us today, but Ethan is going to be able to cover the topic for us. Without further ado, let's hear what Ethan has to say about the new Cap and Invest program in New York State.
Thanks, John, and thanks everybody for being here. It's good to see a lot of familiar faces, yeah, I'm looking forward to getting into this. So yeah, I guess without further ado, we'll just get into it. I guess a little bit of background on me. So my name is Ethan. I use he, him pronouns. I'm calling in from Onondaga territory, so in like Clay, New York area, actually pretty close to Micron, where that's going to go in. And shout out to the work that, Sustain CNY, Greening USA, Dick Cornblue, CNY Solidarity, all them are doing around the Micron stuff. So yeah, I was an organizer. I started as an organizer on college campuses with the New York Public Interest Research Group, NYPIRG. I oversaw their upstate New York organizing program. And then I organized with literacy efforts for a couple of years. And now I'm back to the environmental advocacy stuff with Citizen Action, organizing across the state, primarily upstate New York, for them. So let's get into it. If there's an issue with sharing the screen, let me know. Otherwise, I will assume that it's working. Okay. And you can heir me, right?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
All right. And you can see the screen, I'm assuming. Excellent.
Looks good.
Cool. Thanks. So yeah, apologies for Zazu not being able to join today. Something urgent has come up. If you all don't know, the New York State legislative session started this week. And already things are taking off. So she sends her regrets and is looking forward to connecting with Central New York groups soon. So what we'll cover today is a little bit, just a quick overview of citizen action, New Yorker news, and sort of the moment we're in the climate advocacy world. We'll get into a really brief skim of environmental and climate justice, what that actually means. So we're using the same kind of language. And then we'll get into the Cap, Trade, and Invest program, Cap and Invest. I'm going to keep saying this throughout the day, but basically this is a really wonky, policy-heavy program. This is not going to be an exhaustive, in the weeds sort of like thing. This is just going to be an overview, so we sort of have an understanding of what this program is probably going to look like, because the draft regulations haven't come out yet. But again, we'll get into it more, and hopefully it's accessible. If at any time during this it just doesn't make sense, like, please stop me. I'm not going to see the chat very well, so come off mute and just like give me a stop sign. Happy to do that. And then we'll get into the solutions that Cap and Invest, if done well, could actually provide for New York State. And that's the New Yorker News Fund Climate Campaign. So Citizen Action, for those that don't know, we're a statewide advocacy group with members and chapters across New York. We work on a whole bunch of different issues, not just climate. My whole thing is just climate justice. That's my day-to-day. But really, we work on all this stuff that you see here. And our power comes from people coming together and really making their voices heard. We work really closely with the Working Families Party. We do electoral politics, but we also do issue-based stuff, which, again, is more my bread and butter. We have, for our climate justice agenda, 3 main buckets that we really focus on: getting off of fossil fuels, 2 is making polluters pay, and 3 is holding utilities accountable. So you might have seen some of this work that we've been doing with Agree, an amazing organization here in Syracuse, I'm sure you're all familiar with, around the national grid stuff and New York Heat Act and all that. That's all related to the utility accountability. But today we'll get more into the making polluters pay. New Yorker News, if you're not familiar, this is one of the largest coalitions for climate in New York State. They're really unique because they are a coalition of almost 400 organizations that focus on climate issues through the lens of climate justice. That is really to say, and we'll get a little more into it, but really prioritizing and making sure that their advocacy protects and prioritizes the people that are most impacted by the climate crisis. So, in 2019, New Yorker News is one of the leaders in getting the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act passed. That's New York State's landmark climate law that we're still fighting to protect and enforce today. And the coalition lives on. Citizen Action is on the steering committee. And, Greening USA is a member of New Yorker News, CNY Solidarity, CCAA, UCAN, I think Agree is as well. So really, a lot of central New York groups here that work with New Yorker News. Dave Babcock, who I saw in the room as well, works really well with New Yorker News, helping to lead lobby visits. So really, really already some great stuff happening with New Yorker News here in central New York. Only hoping that we can strengthen that because it works. This year, I hope you saw this in 2024, right at the end, we got 2 really important pieces of legislation passed. The first, you'll see the CO2 fracking ban. So we all know that New York State banned fracking, one of the biggest states to do so with a large amount of natural gas reserves to do a full-scale ban. The fracking industry was trying to do a loophole that would allow carbon dioxide instead of frack fluid to frack again in New York. It was insane. It's a loophole. We closed that loophole by getting the governor to sign that bill. Really, really happy about that. And then the Climate Change Superfund Act. This is a really cool piece of legislation. We're only the 2nd state in the country to adopt it so far, right behind Vermont. Essentially, this puts a price tag on the pollution that the biggest polluters have done throughout the decades. So looking at ExxonMobil's of the world, putting a price tag on all those emissions that they've done to exacerbate the climate crisis, and then saying, look, you made the mess, now you clean it up. That keeps us as taxpayers from having to face the burden of paying for climate resilient infrastructure, stuff like that. So really excited about those 2 bills. Can talk more about that after if you'd like and how we got those across the finish line. But yeah, really fun. So quick discussion question. Just what do you think of when you think about the terms climate justice and environmental justice? like I said, I'm down one person, so I'd love to hear a couple other voices if anyone is willing to help me out.
So I think everybody, if you're able to talk or can't unmute, we might have to make an adjustment, but if you can unmute and want to address the question, feel free to.
Well, I'm happy to chime in. This is Don.
Don?
So climate justice is making a change. You know, we have to completely redo our energy systems. We've been relying on fossil fuels forever, and in doing so, it's going to cause a lot of upheavals. So workers in the fossil fuel industry have got to be transitioned to green jobs. And another big part of environmental justice is compensating the communities who've borne the brunt of fossil fuel pollution. You know, poor communities in general.
Yeah, thanks, Don. That's really solid. I appreciate that. Anyone else want to add any other thoughts about that before we move on?
This is Dick.
Hey, Dick.
Second, Don uses comments, but it's not just about fossil fuels. It's about pollution in general and its effect on communities. A perfect example was the attempt to create a sewage treatment plant in Syracuse on the south side, which would had a huge effect in the neighborhood around South Geddes Street. And it was successfully fought off. And factories that are located in neighborhoods of low income and are producing toxic emissions. So it's really climate justice is specific to fossil fuels. Environmental justice is a broader term and really addresses the effects on disadvantaged communities of pollution in general. So it means that we need to address not just fossil fuel issues, but all of the environmental issues that affect human beings.
That is so solid. Thank you both. That's exactly it. I feel like we can just stop here. That was perfect.
No, just let me say one more. Let me say, can I say?
So yeah, exactly like Dick said, right? We've got environmental justice that's kind of this larger umbrella, right? So talking about exposure, toxic pollution, unequal health impacts. So like, you know, communities that live next to highways, stuff like that, right? Noise pollution, land use issues. That's, you know, just people that are disproportionately impacted. And climate change, this is a good quote. Climate change is the biggest environmental justice crisis of the 21st century, right? Kind of what Dick and Don were already saying. This disproportionately impacts people, and oftentimes people that have the least to do with the climate crisis, right? So it's really a justice issue. So it's applying that environmental justice lens to the climate crisis, right? There's tons of different ways to tackle the climate crisis, and you know we need all sorts of them. But really, what New Yorker News and Citizen Action and so many other really great groups in this area prioritize is that environmental justice lens. So really making sure when we're talking about passing legislation or you know regulations or whatever it is, that we're prioritizing low to moderate income people, especially people in disadvantaged communities, that sort of thing, front and center, right? It's really important to how we move forward. And I'm going to skip this one discussion question because it's already been good, but solid. Oh, am I frozen? Oops. Okay. So, you know, for too long, ExxonMobil, other major oil and gas companies, they knew what they were doing to the climate, right? I don't need to get into this exhaustively, but essentially it's in this proof, right? They hired their own scientists. Their own scientists were asked the question, what happens if we keep emitting the way that we're emitting? You know, this is back in what, the 70s or 80s. And their own scientists that they hired said, yeah, if you keep doing this, you will create devastation for the world. And they're like, okay, noted. And we're going to keep doing that. So they did. And they poured money into confusing the public. They poured money into politicians' bank accounts, all to create the system that we live in now. Like Don mentioned, like this is we're in this really tough fossil fuel stranglehold, right? So it's about how do we break free from that? And part of that is really holding polluters accountable. So when New Yorkers deserve, we know family sustaining jobs, fresh air and water, utilities that are really accountable to the community, and just to make sure that we're creating that new renewable energy economy that works for everybody. Dick already mentioned this, but I would love to hear this, just especially, you know, I didn't grow up in Syracuse area. I'm here now, but I've been here for about a decade. What do you all see in Central New York, or if you're not in Central New York, what are some of the biggest environmental or climate injustices that you're seeing right here? Love to just hear one or two.
My choir, this is Dick Schutzel. My choir has a text string where we're all laughing about our old school winter and how wonderful it is to have a winter. You ask backyard, there's snow in my backyard. And I do a lot of skiing, and I see the economic impacts that are happening, what's happening with snowmobilers, everything else.
Yeah.
It's impossible to cross-country ski, except for this year. Hopefully, climate change, in a very selfish capacity, will create more warming of the water. We'll get more of this lake effect engine for the next 30 years before it's too warm for any snow to be developed. So that is, I think, the most real example. And if you talk to the people that operate the ski centers, they all know if there's no snow in my backyard, I'm not going skiing.
Yeah. Yeah, the economic impacts of that are crazy. I was thinking about that with snowmobiling too, especially in some of those Adirondack areas, right? That's like their whole winter income. That's great. Thanks, Dick. Good to see you. Anyone else have environmental or climate injustice they're seeing right now?
I see Don Hughes has raised his hand. Is that to answer that?
I keep piping up here. Yeah.
Yeah, please.
I would be remiss to not talk about lead paint. Lead paint is a huge, huge problem in Syracuse. We're a community that stands out in childhood blood poisoning by lead. And that definitely affects the poorer community, especially the Black community, living in old housing stock, which is deteriorating.
Yeah, that's huge.
Huge issue.
Yeah, yeah, and I'll just piggyback on that. The old housing stock, not insulated, probably not air conditioned. People who are having to live in that thing are paying more for utilities and are suffering more through the extremes of the temperature range, whether it is the heat or probably the cold as well. And so, yeah, I mean, there's a big adaptation piece that I suppose needs to happen in terms of our housing, and that's affecting the marginal population more critically.
Again, can I add a note there? Can you hear me?
Please. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I just wanted to bring up 2 points. I think you're absolutely right in terms of housing stock and materials and embedded energies that have in our community. One of the biggest problems we have is we don't have policies for recovering embedded energy as well as usable materials, and housing stock is enormous. We need environmental, our history here, you talk about being here 10 years, I've been here all of my years, which is a few now. But the point here is that the loss of the quality of the living environments that used to be spectacular based around city schools and neighborhoods here is a resource that's not being covered and is systemically a negative environmental impact on our community. I see it as a massive, it again is not kind of coordinated between city and county as a common issue for all of us. So I just want to add that.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah. All right. Thanks all. I really appreciate that. I appreciate that I get to stop hearing my voice for a minute and then to hear some really smart comments. So thanks for that, and please keep it up. Cool. And I'll also point to, like what some of these comments are saying, like whose voices need to be prioritized for a just transition, right? Like it's the people that are really facing these disproportionate impacts, right? That's really how I'm happy to say, like, that's really how citizen action works. And I know a lot of folks in New York news as well. So yeah, cool. Let's keep it going. So Our top priority here at New Yorker News is investments, investments, investments. So everyone's talking about how expensive the climate law will be, right? They're saying the transition to renewable energy is absolutely going to be expensive. It's all the opponents' talking points, right? And there's also good people, there's supportive people that also, raise an eyebrow and they say, what's the price tag going to be? And that's fair, right? I think the other question is price tag for who? That's what I'm more interested in. So what we need to do is really find these revenues, right? So Citizen Action is a part of the Invest in Our New York campaign. I know so is CNY Solidarity, very closely aligned with them as well. And I'm sure other groups, but essentially it's finding revenue for New York State to invest in things that affect regular New Yorkers in a positive way. So when we get investments right, we're going to see less emissions. We're going to increase environmental and climate justice initiatives, projects, jobs, all sorts of things. There's a lot of reasons to prioritize investments, and we're really excited about this campaign. So how we're going to secure investments in the first stage is really focusing on cap and invest. I know some people are probably already familiar with this. I wish this is one of those moments where I wish we were in person. Can anyone raise their hand or just say in the chat if they've heard of cap and invest or, are somewhat familiar? Just like to get sort of a read at where we're at. Dick, see a hand. Annalise. Oh, hey, Annalise, great to see you. Dick Kornbluth, of course. Great. I know Don Hughes is definitely. Dave, yep. Kayla, cool, awesome. So there's some familiarity, great. Again, I said this at the top of the meeting, but I'm really going to keep this at like a 101 level, okay? Just because this is going to be a policy wonky thing. And we're still waiting for New York State to release the draft regulations for this program. So we can speculate, and there are going to be some things that are more likely true than not. But we really need to react to these draft regulations that should be coming out. Our intel is probably before the end of this month. But it's extremely late, to be clear, like over a year late. So this needs to happen. And then we can decide if this is really going to be a good program or not. And we're going to fight to make it one that actually brings that climate justice perspective. All right, I'm going to share a video. I asked John to ping me if you don't hear the sound on this. So I'm going to try.
This year, Governor Hochul is proposing a nation-leading program to protect our environment and fund a sustainable future for New Yorkers.
It's called Cap and Invest. Here's how it would work.
New York State will set a statewide cap on climate pollution. Every year, the cap will be set lower to align with our climate goals, protecting the health of New Yorkers and our environment.
Major polluters will pay to emit greenhouse gases, generating revenue directly from those responsible for climate pollution.
The revenue will be invested in clean, affordable energy across the state, prioritizing communities that have borne the brunt of environmental pollution for decades.
The program will support energy efficiency upgrades, renewable energy development, clean transportation, and other projects that will put New York on a path toward a cleaner, greener future.
The program also includes an annual climate action credit, which will put money back in New Yorkers' pockets and support our path to energy affordability.
By building a Cap and Invest program, New York is undertaking one of the most ambitious efforts in the nation to reduce emissions.
And that's what it means to be a climate leader.
Okay, can you hear me again? I think you probably can.
Yes, we can.
All right, cool. Sorry. Was that like really skippy? It was kind of skippy on my end.
That seemed fine.
Okay, cool. Anyway, so that's a very brief overview of how New York State was selling this program. Why am I not? Sometimes technology is just the worst. Okay, there we go. Okay, so that's how New York State is selling it. Okay, so keep in mind, like, our job as activists is to not just like let the story end when New York State says they're going to be a climate leader, right? Like, do you ever fully just believe that your our elected officials are just always going to do it perfectly? Like, no, they need, like, this is democracy, right? Like, they need to hear from us about how to make this good, from our perspectives. And that's why it's important we bring the right perspectives, right? Like climate and environmental justice, for example. So cap and invest. It requires polluters to pay to pollute, essentially, right? So polluters have to buy allowances, and they have a cap on how many allowances they can have at a certain year, okay? That cap, if done the right way, will go down gradually year by year. Should I say what happens if not done well? The cap is meaningless, and they just pay to pollute, and they can pollute. And these are billionaires that, essentially have endless money. So that's not the way. But what we want to see is that cap. So folks, they're the Exxon Mobils, all the big polluters, they can't pollute past that cap, and they have to pay to get there. The revenue that we get that goes to New York State can then be invested in really important things to get us that renewable energy economy. Our focus is really on, providing revenue to those low to moderate income households. Or not revenue, sorry, like investments into the low to moderate income households. That's where the New York Renews Fund climate campaign really comes in. So very, very top level overview. Essentially why we need this is this reduces the emissions, and also makes polluters pay instead of regular people. It's important that we make sure we're keeping the pressure on, so that once we see these draft regulations, they're actually done in a way that makes sense. And because done wrong, this can actually hurt communities more that are already on the front lines of pollution. And I can get into that in a second. So the way that this program is going to be implemented is with two state agencies, the DEC and NYSERDA, so the Department of Environmental Conservation and the New York State Energy and Research Development Authority. They will be charged with implementing the Cap and Invest program. They're going to determine, the limits, the prices. There's an auctioning system that I would suggest is more in the 102 of this presentation. And essentially that money, right, that price then goes into the New York State Climate Action Fund. That's what we're advocating for. In 2023, we created that New York State Action Fund, Climate Action Fund. We want to see that money go there, and then we can really decide how that goes back to the community. So we need to make sure the limit on pollution needs to be strict, right? Like I said earlier, if we have this cap and it's meaningless, polluters are just paying to pollute. But we need to do more than that. We need to make sure that we're hitting our climate, or working really seriously toward our emission mandates to reduce our emissions outlined by the climate law. The price to pollute also needs to be high. It can't just be like, a drop in the bucket. We need to make sure polluters actually feel the cost of this. And so they're, incentivized to transition to the renewable energy economy. And we shouldn't be allowed to have offsets. So there are states like California and Washington that have versions of the Cap and Invest program already. And I believe both, I know Washington state allows for offsets. So apparently, or not apparently, basically what happens is the polluters, they hit their cap, that's all they can pollute, but then they do some offsets, like invest in, I don't know, forest or something, probably not, trees, right? And then that counts against the amount they've already polluted. We don't want to see that for a number of reasons. Annalise, what's up?
I had two things I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
So when the company that goes below the max emissions that they've purchased, are they allowed to sell their credits to another company or no?
That is such a great question. So this is the trading component. This is like the secondary market to Cap and Invest that can happen. So essentially, exactly as Annalise pointed out, say company A bought this much allowances, doesn't need to use it all. They can then sell it to another polluter that already reached their cap. So then they're going above that cap, that second polluter, because they bought in the secondary market those allowances. Is that too wonky? Should I explain that in a better way? Okay. Annalise, does that answer the question a little bit?
Yeah, I appreciate that. So thank you for that one. But the only other question I wanted to know is like the fees that they're paying, is that because in the video it mentioned that money was going to like individual New Yorkers. So is that being funded from the fees or somewhere else?
Yeah. So Hochul has last year said that she wants to carve out a third, I believe, and I have a great article on this that I'm going to send out after that just came out today on Cap and Invest. But a third of those revenues, Hochul says, wants to go back to New Yorkers in affordability measures. So other states have direct rebate programs, and it looks like New York is going to try and do the exact same thing. Again, how that is done needs to be in a way that really works, right? And in a climate justice perspective. Don, what's up?
Yeah, so can you, and maybe you're probably getting to this, but what's a polluter? I mean, everybody drives down the road as a polluter.
Yeah. So we're really focusing on, I think we're gonna have to look at the draft regulations to make sure, right? So like some examples, they only do like power plants. I believe really what we want to see is this to be economy wide. Look, I don't know what that would mean for like individuals. I feel like that's not the level we're talking about. But again, this is more like a draft regulation we need to see sort of, answer, which again should be before the end of the month. But what we really have in mind are like major polluters, right? Like that are emitting tons of emissions every year and buying those allowances to do that. Does that make a little more sense, Don? I'm sorry, it's
I
kind of
guess
hazy.
so, and maybe it also means that the folks that are selling fossil fuels would be considered polluters. That's because they're aggregate. They're selling the fuels, the gasoline, the coal, or whatever.
Right.
That's going to get burned.
Right. Yeah. I'm not sure about that, just because I know it's based on like tons of emission, like greenhouse gas emissions. So I don't know. But again, I feel like this is gonna be one of those things that we can really dig into once the draft regulations are released, hopefully before the end of the month. Thanks for that question. Any other immediate questions? I agree with Don. We are all
Ethan, I might add, and I know you mentioned it, and you don't plan to speak much about it, and maybe you don't even know yet because it's too early. What would be the relationship between the Climate Superfund Act as it generates revenue and the Cap and Invest program?
That is such a solid question, and was just asked yesterday too at a meeting I had. So great ideas, right, of creating revenue that we need to see for climate. However, they're in two different ways. So Cap and Invest is going forward on emissions, right? So think of Cap and Invest as these are future emissions, these are current emissions. The Climate Change Superfund Act is really looking at historical emissions. That's putting a price tag on what Exxon, for example, has already done, and then putting a price on that, saying, look, you already did this damage, and now it's up to you to clean up that mess in the form of investing in climate mitigation things specifically. Does that make some sense, John?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I'm so excited about the Climate Superfund, but it's going to be litigated a lot. Vermont is already seeing that. So that just really is another reason why we need to double down to make sure Cap and Invest is good, because it can happen sooner. In that New York Focus article that I'm going to send to you all after this, an anonymous source said that Governor Hochul expects to see revenue from Cap and Invest this year in 2025, which would be much faster than the Climate Superfund. Cool. Yes, Kayla asking a great question. How will these caps affect item pricing? Yes, that's going to be the opposition, right? Like if you're charging your utility or like your energy company, right? you're charging a polluter that creates energy to pay more. Where do they put that? And the opponents will say they put that onto the consumer. That's why Hochul is really focusing on this affordability rebate program. New York Focus does a good job at outlining this. It actually shows that by the 2030 climate mandate goal of reducing emissions, should cap and invest go the right way, you're not going to see an increase largely for most households. However, in the beginning, there may be an increase for some households. It's important that we do this in a way that doesn't overburden or burden disadvantaged communities, low to moderate income households, folks that can't afford to pay more, right? But look, I think there's a lot of ways. We got to look at the draft regulations to make sure that's a really important piece of that and make sure legislation follows. Does that make sense? It's a great question, Kayla. But it's really important that we get that back to consumers. Joey, do we know if highways become as major polluters? I don't think so. I would be surprised by that. But again, I think that's going to be a draft regulations sort of question. Chris, do credits need to be used, sold, or bought within the same time period in which the emissions are generated? That is such a great question. So that's what we're fighting. No banking credits. We don't want folks to just bank up credits because they had, a year where they decided not to emit a lot or didn't have to. We want to get rid of that. But yes, Chris, absolutely. If done wrong, these corporations can bank credits. And as Annalise pointed out, they can buy other credits. And then they can just have this, these are very rich corporations. They're just going to keep banking it up, right? We can't see that. That's what we want to get rid of. We got to make sure it's done right. We are not at all citizen action, I will say. I won't speak for anyone else, but we are not going to be really excited about Cap Invest and just be full-throated support for it if it isn't done right. This needs to be done right because polluters can still pollute a lot and not get us where we need to be. These are great questions. Scott, what's up?
Yeah, the video mentioned climate action credits. Is that synonymous with the 1/3 of the revenue that Hochul wants to give back to New Yorkers? Is that the same thing?
I'm not sure. I actually didn't catch that, the climate action credits. I think that's going to be, we're going to have to look at that. But yeah, so I'm going to get into this more, but all these questions are going to be really important during the public comment period. So they're going to have to go and give this open to the public, right? This is democracy. So they're going to have public hearings. We need to be the ones that go out there and say, look, exactly that. What are you talking about with climate action credits? And does it actually benefit regular people? And we need to make sure they do that. So yeah, stay tuned, I think is my immediate answer, which isn't satisfying, but it's government, I guess. Cool. Peter, that's an excellent question. One of which, yeah, I think that's going to be Cap and Invest, I think, has more of a connection with the RGGI program. They're really similar. And I was just, I'm not familiar enough with the RGGI. I know about it, but I can't speak to it too confidently with how that would work with Cap and Invest. But they are very similar, and I think we'll definitely. Sure. Yeah, Kayla, I will get into that for sure. Okay, cool. I'm going to move on. This is great. I appreciate all these comments. So look, we're jumping ahead. This is excellent. So no trading, no pollution hotspots. So when you allow trading, right, you could have a power plant that just keeps polluting because there's no cap, right? While other parts of the state, say, are getting cleaned up. There could be potentials for pollution hotspots. We need to see across the board reductions in emissions, especially, in facilities in overburdened communities. The electricity sector must be included. That's what I was talking about with the utility stuff that Kayla mentioned, I believe. Cool. So recently, some good news from Washington State. They actually had their cap and invest system, which is only 2 years old, go to voters, and voters overwhelmingly supported it. So it was 60% or something voted in favor of maintaining their cap and invest program. That's solid. That's a good sign, right? So maybe even though some folks saw, marginal increases in moderate middle class, upper middle class, whatever, wealthy households, they're still voting to maintain this program. So really solid, exciting news. Would have been a really big bummer if they rejected it right as we're trying to get ours going. So back to New York. What can we do to make sure this is a real program that works for New Yorkers, that isn't just, another way for polluters to keep polluting? There's grassroots comments. We've already generated thousands of those. We've been doing direct lobbying with legislators. I know Dave, I know Dick Schusau, Annalise, I'm sure many others. Sorry if I missed anybody that was with me. We've been meeting with legislators, talking about this stuff. Assemblymember Kellis down in the Southern Tier has a bill that essentially puts these guardrails on cap and invest in a meaningful way. So we've been getting co-sponsorship of that. If you're in the Central New York area, Assemblymember Sturpey has signed on to that. He is, more often than not, really a climate champion. So really appreciate his work on what he does on that. And cap and invest legislation. Oh yeah, that's what I was saying. Cool. So the process, getting back to Kayla's question too about the how are the public hearings going to be marketed, all that. So our current stage is that they're developing that proposal. That's what I'm talking about, these draft regulations from the DEC and NYSERDA. After that, we're going to have more hearings. How are you going to know about it? That's our job, right? Like, activists need to make sure that we're recruiting as much as we can, doing outreach, because at the end of the day, there's so many public hearings that happen all the time and just aren't well attended. This can't be one of these, right? We need to make sure that we're doing this. So New Yorker News has their eye on the prize here. We will know when the public hearings are as soon as we can, and then we're going to organize to get people there. Hopefully they're offered over Zoom and in person. I don't know if you remember this with the Climate Action Council scoping plan. Those were across the state in different regions where people could offer public comment. Really hoping it's the same kind of process here. Cool. So the fight ahead, we got to fight. We got to fight for these real regulations, and then we got to fight for good investments. We can't just let this revenue come in and make up for, shortfalls in other places that aren't, super beneficial to New Yorkers and climate justice. I'm going to skip that because we've already done some really good questions, and I'm running a little late or long. So the Fund Climate campaign, I will get into this relatively quickly, but this is really exciting. This is what New Yorker News is pushing. We're talking about that link between climate and housing justice. We're talking about taking this new revenue and putting that into low to moderate income households that, as was mentioned earlier, need to do things like, insulate, that need to do, new energy efficiency things for them to get to decarbonizing. I saw someone from Energy Smart CNY, I think, on this call. All the great work they do. This is all about getting more funding for people to work toward decarbonizing their homes. And we want to see free heat pumps, more free heat pumps to more people. So yeah, we want to see lower energy costs. We want to see home repair, energy improvements, all these things that are really important. Hazard remediation, right? Talking about the lead crisis in Syracuse, for example. All these things need to be addressed, and with this new revenue, we can start to focus on that. Yeah, I won't get into that anymore, I guess. Cool. So yeah, this is really the big thing. We're having what we're calling our marquee program here at New Yorker News. We're working with legislators to get this thing up off the ground. It's new. It's still in development, but essentially, this is going to be a really, really important program that's going to be across the state, focusing on the affordability crisis, on the housing crisis, on the climate crisis, all these things, and really wrapping that into a robust program that focuses on low to moderate incomes and their households and improving those houses. Yeah. Another part of this that I think is especially exciting for probably nonprofits, and especially, maybe municipalities, is we want to see a community-directed grant program come out of these new funds. So part of what we're advocating for is that we can really get, some of this new revenue to go into clean energy projects in certain municipalities or communities. We want to see this go into, green jobs, things like that. So, or, even groups that are really pushing for this. So that's how we can make sure that money is actually used in an effective way, get it back into the community in a meaningful way, get it to the people that should be organizing these solutions. Be the first of its kind. This is all kind of redundant, sorry. Energy planning more democratic, sure. Yeah, so just transition. That's really what we're all about, right? This just transition, climate, jobs, and justice. We got to make sure labor standards are in there. We got to make sure it's actually protecting the most disadvantaged communities, frontline communities that are already feeling the burden of this, and make sure they're seeing the impacts of this funding. Push Buffalo, if you're not familiar, they're great group over in Western New York. They're on the steering committee of New York Renews and just do some great stuff. They have awesome training programs for people to get training in clean energy jobs. It's really, really great. They're constantly expanding it and are really doing an effective job of organizing that. Really cool to see. Just an example of what a good community directed grant could possibly do. I'm going to skip that now. So basically, because I'm kind of running low, we're also working on the New York Heat Act, taking the lead from the Renewable Heat Now Coalition, and big players like Agree to support that work. The New York Heat Act, if you're already familiar, really, really important piece of legislation we need to see across the finish line this year. And that's pretty much it, I would say. Yeah, I will take any questions. I feel like kind of running toward the end here.
So you can put in the chat whether you have a question. If you don't want to write out your question, you put question, and we'll recognize you, or simply raise your hand with your buttons on your Zoom. So I'll just throw in a couple just to get you to clarify. So the fund climate campaign is intended to be, let's call it a blueprint that New York Renews and Citizen Action is developing for your sort of recommendations for where the money needs to go. Is that correct? Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, that's exactly right. So it's going to include at least one piece, probably more, of legislation, but that's down the line. But we also have criteria for where we think effective spending should be, and to make sure that this money just doesn't come in and then is used in ways that aren't how it should be, right? So yes, the Fund Climate Campaign puts on guardrails for how that cap and invest money should be used, or at least a portion of it, in an effective way that really respects climate justice.
And that'll interface with this rulemaking process.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then your last slide, you might have to refresh your memory refresh my memory about the New York Heat Act and how that fits into this. There's a little bit more.
Yeah, the New York Heat Act is just an incredibly, incredibly important piece of legislation that almost passed the finish line last year, got held up in the assembly. But essentially, it does a lot of things, but one of the most important things from Citizen Action's perspective is that it puts a limit on your utility bills to 6% of your household income. Also, it gets rid of existing subsidies that we give to the utilities and the oil and gas companies to essentially do free pipelines. We don't want to see that. We want to see the transition off of gas and oil, right? So the New York Heat Act really takes important steps to do that. It also gives the Public Service Commission, which regulates utilities, more teeth in getting us to our climate goals.
Oh, thank you. And one more thing, I don't see any hands yet. Hopefully I'm not missing somebody. I know you've got some organizational and lobbying activities planned, even though Greening USA is 501c3. We're not supposed to be lobbying, but I think you're planning to have some meetings with the community for further education and education of legislators. do you want to tell us what's coming up on your agenda?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, John. So the biggest thing that we have going on is January 22nd. We're doing a mass mobilization for the Fund Climate campaign. So we're all coming to Albany. All of New Yorker News is joining together at the Capitol. We're going to hold a big rally and press conference, and then we're going to meet with legislators immediately after, talking about why we want to see these smart investments and make polluters pay. So it's going to be really good. We already have, hundreds of RSVPs. We'll be coordinating buses from different regions across the state, and I'm doing carpools from Syracuse area. If you want to go, definitely sign up. It's going to be really fun. If you haven't done a rally before in Albany, they are really exciting. It's a long day. I'm not going to sugarcoat that, but it's fulfilling. And really makes an impact in setting the agenda for the rest of the legislative session. If you're interested in learning more, I put the RSVP link in the chat.
Anne's got her.
Yeah, that's great. There's also, there's a lot more too, but I can follow up.
Anne got her hand, has her hand raised.
Anne?
Yeah, hi.
Thanks.
I'm actually in Maryland. I just happened to see your this presentation listed inside it. I was wondering, in addition to Washington, have any other states passed such legislation? And typically, does this come from the governor, or can it come also as well from the legislators proposing the legislation?
Yeah, that's a great question, Anne. So I know California also has a cap and invest system in place. As to other states, I'm not sure there's any beyond California and Washington at the moment, but I could be off there. The thing about these programs is that the broad concept of them is actually used across the world. Different countries are already doing versions of this. The key is really, and I hate to say it because I hate being told this whenever I answer a question, but the devil's in the details, right? Like, we need to make sure this is one that actually really works, because there are really soft versions of cap and invest that just don't do what you need to do. And then as far as how this came about, so in New York State, this came about, interestingly, through the climate law. So part of the climate law was that there was the Climate Action Council that created essentially guidelines or rules for what the law had to do. Cap and invest was one of those provisions that they laid in.
Got it. Thank you.
Thanks for that question, Anne. That's great.
It came from the governor. The initiation actually went to the governor, and she proposed the legislation.
Yes. In 2023, she had legislation, but it came from the Climate Action Council's what they call scoping plan. Yeah.
I'm in Maryland, and we now have a very progressive, and this may be something he'd be willing to push in this budget cutting year.
Yeah, I mean, look, make polluters pay makes sense to people, right? Like, when we're seeing these huge price tags, like I mentioned at the beginning of the call, like, we know who's been making a lot of money getting us into the climate crisis. And at some point, they need to pay. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I see some questions in the chat. I'm not sure if we've addressed them. So there's one, are there incentives for landlords to refit rental homes? I don't know if, and then I suppose that would be something that could be dealt with in the regulations for the fund.
Yeah, that got brought up at a lobby meeting too. It's a really great question, whoever asked that. I can't speak to that specifically. That seems to me like that's going to be something to make sure we advocate for, right?
It just seemed like something that could be part of addressing low income.
Yeah, no,
issues,
that's what I'm thinking of too. Yeah.
Yeah, as well as cleaning up the environment, but it'd be an initiative for, if there's incentives for landlords to do it, it would make it cheaper for the tenants as well. So
absolutely, yeah. I have to imagine that's going to be included, right? Especially when we're thinking about like New York City, right? Like, there's just so many tenants. So yeah, absolutely, cool. I see a hand from Chris.
Yeah, thanks. given what we're seeing in Los Angeles now and sort of the lack of infrastructure to deal with some of these climate catastrophes, are you advocating that the funds could be used for climate adaptation measures as well as mitigation?
Yeah, I think that's got to be a part of it. Our main thing with New Yorker News is really like the decarbonizing homes aspect of this. That's going to be our top priority. But that's like, that's what the climate change superfund folks are really interested in. So yeah, I mean, it's got to be a huge part of it, right? That's super expensive to do. And who pays for that is going to be an important question, right? But yeah, I heard about that. And I guess I didn't really realize, I'm not at all a housing expert, but I heard on NPR the other day that there are like much better materials for home building, right? That are much less flammable than what exists now, but it's just much more expensive. So
we're also learning today that their water systems were just inadequate to fight forest fires in an urban setting. So there's all sorts of things that may have not even been accounted for.
Totally. Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, I think that's that's something that needs to be brought up in the public hearings, right? But yeah, that's solid.
Thank you.
John, what's up?
Yeah, so a couple questions. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. When they're talking about greenhouse gases, does that include everything, or is this completely focused on CO2? That's my first question.
That's a good question. My understanding is it's just CO2, but I could be wrong on that, and that might be a draft regulations question. I can look into that for sure, but my gut says it's based on tons of CO2 emitted.
Okay. Well, frequently things are portrayed in terms of CO2 equivalents, so it could be, and I'm hoping that this includes things like methane emissions, and we got chips manufacturers that are using fluorinated gases, which are super potent greenhouse gases. My second question has to do with EVs. Do you see build out of charging stations, for example, or more incentives for people to buy EVs as part of this?
Absolutely. I mean, I feel like that's one of those things. I've actually had conversations about that with some other partners in New Yorker News, and like one of those community directed grants sort of like exciting things is like if a community really like that's a project they want to undertake, right? Maybe like a really good charging station or whatever. I'm not like super well versed on EVs, but what would be useful for EV rollout in your community? And I'm sure there's like infrastructure, right, that needs to be built for that besides just charging stations. Like what are some things that EV?
Yeah, I mean, the charging stations are the big thing, and the connection to the grid to support that.
And I think about, Don, what we were doing with Barry and CCAA and all that with the electric bus webinar stuff, like e-buses could absolutely be a community grant, right? Like the impacts of that, the positive impacts of that on a community are huge. I think like that'd be amazing, right? So that's why we're excited about that part of it. Besides just the home decarbonization, the community directed grants. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Makes a lot of sense to us, but it doesn't make a lot of sense to a lot of other people, as you've seen in the e-buses.
Yeah, so and that's the public
some
pressure.
Convincing to do.
Yeah, that's what we do, though, right? Like that, Don. You're a veteran activist, but like, and somebody on this call, like that's what we have to do. Like we have to do the public education, like Kayla mentioned. We have to let people know about the public hearings. I want to make sure that we're letting people know about the basics of cap and invest. So when we get to the draft regulations and we get to the hearings, people feel a little more comfortable knowing, like not only what this program is in a 10,000 foot view, but also what stands to be gained from it. And if we can put those two together, I really think we can create an effective group of people to make this happen.
I agree.
Cool.
I see Melanie raised the question about employment and having trained technicians available to
Yeah.
service the green economy.
Yeah.
I know you talked about Push and
Mhm.
their efforts. Can you talk a little bit more about your plans to include employment training and all that kind of thing in the program?
Yeah, so I'll say, right now, right, it's like those community directed grants are going to be specific to communities. It's going to be based on community need and like regular grant processes, and hopefully not, too cumbersome. But that's going to be up to communities, like what Push Buffalo did. If you're not familiar with Push, definitely check them out. They're truly amazing. They identified at least two needs in their community, which was the housing crisis and also the climate crisis. And they put those things together and are doing that workforce training right out of their own, center, which is really cool. So there's stuff like that can be done, but it's going to be specific to communities. But again, I think those community directed grants are exactly a great option for that. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like an important piece of the whole puzzle. Getting a technician to come is very difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Bob Haley, are
Yeah.
you raising your hand?
Yeah, thank you. Along that line about how is Push Buffalo a municipal entity or an activist or a not-for-profit? And
Yeah,
secondly, what's happening in terms of informing municipalities to link them to by training or linking to these advantages, because it's through the kind of integration of these fundings that you'll get the best benefit out systemically to everyone in the community. What's happening there?
that's a great question. So the first is that Push is a nonprofit. And this sort of leads into the second question, and this is like sort of our theory of change, I guess, at Citizen Action is like what Push did so well is that they linked constituents' needs with people in power and made like real solutions happen. Right. So they sought out funding. They did the things they needed to do. They created coalitions. They did all the organizing that had to be done at the community level. And then they worked with, their municipalities and those partnerships to get that funding in. And also, I think there was probably, I don't know their back end, but I'm assuming there's a lot of different funding sources for that center. But, that's what Citizen Action believes in, right? Like we believe in organizing people, creating these partnerships with leaders in government, local and state level, to really make sure like we're addressing real needs and working together to build infrastructure, whether that's like advocacy infrastructure, like coalitions, or actually physical infrastructure that we need to see, like community centers, stuff like that, that actually works. So the short answer is, I think nonprofits and good partnerships with municipalities make this stuff happen the best.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great question. Yeah, check them out. I love them. If I lived in Buffalo, I'd absolutely be a member. They're solid.
Yeah, I'll just say thanks also for that particular insight. It's something that Greening USA and our Micron related coalition that we're calling Sustain CNY actually just were discussing the other day in terms of the need to do that upfront education, and so that when the time comes for people to make comments at the public hearings, that they're prepared and feel empowered to stand up and talk. So yeah, that whole infrastructure, organizing infrastructure is an important piece of this, and I really appreciate you educating us about that, as well as about the legislation and what's going on with the programs at the state level. All good stuff that we all need to hear and continue to work on. Especially it's as going forward, maybe in the next 4 years, all this stuff is going to be in our own hands to deal with, and that's what. And I see Peter King has his hand up, and I'll recognize you in a minute. But that's all. one of Greening USA's strategies is to have this forum, and so all of you can have the opportunity to bring your concerns, your expertise, talk about something that you've been working on, so that you can share it with us. And I think Ethan even had a slide about that. As much as we can share what we're doing, we can be more effective. Peter, I see your hand up. Peter King.
Just briefly, most of you probably already know this, but just that the New York State Climate Act itself is based a lot on climate justice concerns, as we've been talking about. That written into the scoping plan and so on, is prioritizing those disadvantaged communities, and that they went ahead and mapped all what they consider to be the disadvantaged communities in DAC maps, disadvantaged area communities. And so this is all kind of everything we've been discussing here fits in with that whole concept. It isn't foreign, but you do have to speak up for
it. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are there any other questions? And while you're maybe getting up the courage to ask it, I will say the invitation is there for you. If you have a topic that you feel needs to have some attention, whether you can make that presentation or you need some help in finding out who would be suitable to make that presentation, please let Greening USA know. You can email info@greeningusa.org to communicate your willingness to put on a presentation or your suggestions to us. And if you are looking for some work to do, you have some time on your hand and want to help out any of these organizations, don't hesitate to volunteer. We can find, Greening USA can find some work for you to do as well. But any of these organizations, I'm sure, would appreciate your volunteer efforts to keep things moving along. I'm trying to look in the chat. I do see six. It says 6 new messages. I'm not sure if any of them are questions.
And Annalise has her hand up.
Oh, thank you.
Annalise has her hand up.
Yep, I wanted to know just after I'm gonna hopefully anyway, Governor Hochul will sign the HEAT Act. Oh goodness, my apologies. But aside from that, what are the next campaigns that you guys plan on working on? Do you ever intend on working on the GAP fund?
Annalise, this is directed at Citizen Action, I'm guessing? Or Greening?
Yeah, I guess so. Citizen Action.
Okay. Yeah, so we have definitely supported the GAP fund. It hasn't been our top priority. I'm not I can ask my policy director why, but yeah, I think it's great. I also think it's something that really makes sense in Syracuse for a lot of the reasons that we mentioned today when it comes to home hazards and remediation and that sort of thing. Definitely check it out, the GAP fund. If you're not familiar, Agree has done great work on that as well. Yeah.
I think I saw something from Kayla in the chat asking about community heat networks. I don't know where the folk. Maybe Chris Carrick might know something about that, or if from his role as former director of energy programs at the Regional Planning Board. I don't know, Ethan, if you know anything about that and the funding and community efforts to organize heat networks.
I do not. Sorry.
Ethan, can you talk about the GAP fund more and what that is?
Yeah, I'm definitely not an expert on the GAP fund. essentially it's like a pre-electrification program. So it's taking care of a lot of the things, my understanding, like insulation, like some of the stuff we mentioned in the Fund Climate campaign. I think there's a lot of similarities there, weatherization, that sort of thing. And it brings money to those homes that need that. So, you know, just like all the expense stuff, like me, for example, my partner and I live in a house in Clay, and our furnace is like just so close to dying. And we really, you know, want a heat pump, but this house needs to be insulated and I just can't swing it. So it's like, you know, helping to get rid of, I think, some of that in between costs. But if anyone else knows more about it, please fill in. I'm definitely not an expert.
There's certainly, NYSERDA certainly has funding out there too. I mean, I'm getting that right now. I just had some insulation put in.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping to get an insulated door.
Nice.
Hopefully.
Cool.
Dick's got his hand up.
What's up, Dick?
Yeah. A little bit about the GAP fund.
Yeah.
One of the major issues with people who live in substandard housing is that insulation work can't be done because of structural problems. So roof leaks, issues like that.
Yeah.
So I was involved in a lot of discussions about the GAP fund probably a couple of years ago when it was being promoted, and I can't remember the details of the dollar amounts involved, although it was really clear to me that the dollar amounts that they were proposing were profoundly inadequate to actually address the actual needs. But the idea of the GAP fund was that for people who are living in substandard housing, who are disadvantaged communities, that the GAP fund would fill in the space between the public available funding for energy improvements and the needs of the building that could not be addressed by the traditional programs that provide energy improvement. So it was about fixing roofs or fixing foundations, et cetera. My concern with it is that the actual if you actually look at what it would actually take. But by the way, in the world of weatherization grants for people who are at low income people, there's a gigantic problem of deferrals because they can't work on the houses where the houses have structural problems. And so those houses fall out of the potential for having insulation, air sealing work done. And there is no program currently existing that addresses those structural needs. So the GAP fund was designed to address some of that, even though if you look carefully at the numbers, I mean, we're talking about houses where you could spend $30,000 just to get the house ready to be insulated. And if you looked at the house, it probably isn't worth $30,000. So that there are sort of problems with it, but the concept is there and it's valid. I don't know if it's going to go anywhere or not.
Thanks, Dick. Yeah, it's interesting. I definitely need to look more into it.
Great discussion, everyone. I think we're about out of time anyways, unless somebody's got a last burning question for Ethan today. I will close out the meeting by saying, Ethan, thank you very much for being here today, sharing what you're doing and educating us, and look forward to working with you as we go forward on your programs and Green USA's programs in 2025. Thanks for being here, everybody. I see Ann George, your hand is up. And
I asked a question: where can I find this video of this presentation? Did you hear me?
Yeah. I wrote back to you actually in the chat. But
oh, you did? I didn't see it. I'm sorry.
Yeah. It'll be available on YouTube. And I'm not sure. I don't do that part of it, so I'm not sure exactly how long after the session it's posted. And you can also link to, if you go to greenusa.org, you can link to the archives of the green bag lunches.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you. Mhm.
Yep.
Well, thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your day, and we'll see you next month.
Thanks for the
Yeah,
presentation.
thanks everybody. Really appreciate the time.
Live long and prosper.
Yeah,
Thank you.
no nukes.
Okay,
That's another
right.
issue.
Hey,
that's right.
yes. Okay. I